When the heat breaks the silence. The girl shouldn't have been alive, not out here, not in this heat, not after 3 days without water. But Elias Ward heard her anyway, a sound so faint it barely rose above the wind tearing through the canyon. He'd ridden out to check fence lines before the storm hit, and now he stood frozen in his saddle, listening. There it was again. A whimper. Human. Small. He swung down from his horse and pushed through scorched brush until he found her, collapsed against a lightning-split aspen, lips cracked white, skin burning under his palm. She opened her eyes once. "Please," she whispered. Then nothing. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're here for the whole ride, hit that like button now. You're going to want to see how this ends. The thunder came first, a low rumble that rolled across the high country like something alive and angry. Then the wind followed, tearing through the dry grass and shaking the pine branches until they hissed. Elias Ward pulled his hat down tight and urged his horse forward, eyes scanning the ridgeline where his fence posts marked the northern boundary of his land. He didn't have much time. The sky had gone green at the edges, and that meant hail. Maybe worse. He'd lived alone in these mountains for 8 years, and he knew the weather better than he knew most people. Summer storms came fast and mean, especially in July when the heat built up all day and had nowhere to go but sideways. This one had been brewing since noon, hanging heavy over the peaks, waiting for the right moment to break loose. Elias didn't mind storms. He minded losing cattle. He minded fence lines snapping. He minded spending the next week repairing what could have been secured in an hour. His gelding, a sturdy bay named Rust, picked his way carefully over the loose shale that covered the trail. They'd made this ride 100 times, but never this late, never with the light fading and the wind kicking up dust devils that spun and died in the gullies below. Elias could taste copper in the air, metallic, sharp, the flavor of lightning about to strike. He reached the first fence post and dismounted, checking the tension on the barbed wire. Solid. He moved to the second, then the third, working quickly, efficiently, the way a man does when he's alone and there's no one else to pick up the slack if he fails. That's when he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind. It had a voice sometimes, especially when it funneled through the narrow gaps between the canyon walls. But this was different, softer, weaker, almost lost beneath the roar of the approaching storm. Elias straightened, one hand still on the fence wire, and listened. There it was again. A sound like something breaking. Not wood, not metal. Human. He let go of the wire and turned slowly, scanning the slope below him. Nothing but rock and scrub brush and a stand of aspens that had been half burned in a wildfire 2 summers back. Their white trunks stood like bones against the darkening sky. The sound came again, and this time he pinpointed it, downhill, maybe 50 yards. Elias didn't hesitate. He left Rust tied to the fence post and started moving, boots slipping on the loose gravel as he descended. The wind slapped at his back, shoving him forward, and the first drops of rain hit his shoulders, fat, heavy, cold. He reached the edge of the aspen stand and stopped. There, crumpled against the base of a tree split clean down the middle by lightning, was a child. A girl. Maybe 9 or 10 years old. Her dress was torn, filthy, soaked through with sweat and rain. Her hair hung in matted tangles across her face, and her arms were wrapped tight around her knees, like she'd been trying to make herself as small as possible. Elias knelt beside her, heart hammering in his chest. "Hey," he said, voice rough from disuse. He didn't talk much these days. "Hey, can you hear me?" The girl didn't move. He reached out carefully and touched her shoulder. She was burning up, skin so hot it shocked him. He pulled his hand back, then forced himself to try again, this time brushing the hair away from her face. Her eyes opened. Just a sliver, pale blue, glassy with fever. "Please," she whispered. The word was barely there, more breath than sound. Then her eyes closed again, and her head lolled to the side. Elias swore under his breath and scooped her up in one motion. She weighed nothing, less than nothing, just bones and heat and shallow breathing that rattled in her chest like something loose and broken. The storm hit full force as he climbed back up the slope. Rain came down in sheets, turning the ground to mud, soaking through his coat and shirt until he couldn't tell where the rain ended and his own sweat began. Thunder cracked so close it felt like the sky splitting open, and Russ spooked, pulling against the reins and tossing his head. "Easy," Elias said, though he didn't know if he was talking to the horse or himself. He shifted the girl's weight in his arms and grabbed the reins with one hand, pulling Russ close. "We're going home. Now." He didn't bother with the saddle. He just held the girl tight against his chest, swung up onto Rust's back, and kicked hard. The gelding lunged forward, hooves slipping on the wet rock, and they were moving, fast, reckless, racing the storm down the mountain. By the time they reached the cabin, the world had gone dark. Rain hammered the roof, poured off the eaves in thick curtains, turned the yard into a shallow lake. Elias didn't care. He slid off Rust's back, kicked open the cabin door, and carried the girl inside. The cabin was small, one room with a stove, a table, a bed in the corner, and a few shelves holding supplies. It smelled like wood smoke and coffee and the kind of silence that settles when a man lives alone for too long. Elias laid the girl on the bed, pulled off her wet dress, and wrapped her in every blanket he owned. She didn't wake, didn't stir, just lay there, chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. He lit the stove, put water on to boil, and soaked a rag in the cold rainwater he'd collected in a basin by the door. Then he sat beside her and pressed the rag to her forehead, her neck, her wrists, anywhere the fever burned hottest. "Come on," he muttered, wringing out the rag and pressing it to her skin again. "Don't quit on me." He didn't know why he said it. He didn't know this girl, didn't know where she'd come from, or how she'd ended up collapsed in the middle of nowhere. But something about the way she'd looked at him, those pale blue eyes full of something too old for a child, had lodged itself under his ribs and wouldn't let go. He stayed beside her all night, cooling her skin, giving her water when she stirred enough to swallow, keeping her awake when her breathing got too shallow. The storm raged outside and the cabin creaked and groaned, but inside it was just the two of them, a man who'd forgotten how to care for anyone but himself, and a girl who'd been left to die. By morning, the fever broke. The sun came up hot and merciless, the way it always did after a storm. The air smelled clean, scrubbed raw by the rain, and the light poured through the cabin's single window in a shaft so bright it hurt to look at. Elias woke slumped in the chair beside the bed, neck stiff, back aching. He opened his eyes and found the girl staring at him. She was awake, really awake. Her eyes were clear now, focused, and she was watching him the way a wild animal watches, ready to bolt, ready to fight, ready to do whatever it took to survive. "Easy," Elias said, holding up his hands. "You're safe." The girl didn't move, didn't blink. "I found you out in the storm," he continued, voice low and steady. "You were in bad shape, fever, dehydration. You've been asleep for most of a day." Still nothing. Elias stood slowly, moving to the stove to pour water into a tin cup. He brought it back and set it on the edge of the bed, within her reach, but not too close. "You need to drink," he said. "Slow, just a little at a time." The girl's eyes flicked to the cup, then back to him. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then slowly, she reached out and picked it up. Her hands shook, but she managed to bring it to her lips and take a small sip. Elias exhaled and sat back down. "What's your name?" he asked. The girl lowered the cup. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse and cracked. "Lena." "Lena," Elias repeated. "I'm Elias. This is my cabin. You're in the high country, about 15 miles north of the nearest settlement." Lena's eyes widened slightly, and she looked past him toward the window. The mountains stretched out beyond the glass, endless and unforgiving. "How'd you end up out here?" Elias asked. Lena's grip tightened on the cup. She looked down at her hands, at the bruises on her wrists, at the cuts on her palms. "I ran," she said quietly. Elias waited. "There were men," she continued, voice barely above a whisper. "They said I belonged to them, said they had papers, legal papers. They said I had to go with them, had to work for them until I'd paid back what my family owed." Elias felt something cold settle in his chest. "What kind of work?" Lena shook her head. "I don't know. They didn't say, but I heard them talking about places where girls go and don't come back. The cold turned to ice. So you ran, Elias said. Lena nodded. I ran for 3 days. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stop. And they came after you. They always come after you, Lena said, and there was something in her voice, something hard and flat and far too old, that made Elias believe her. He stood and moved to the window, staring out at the mountains. The sun was climbing higher now, burning off the last of the rain, turning the peaks sharp and bright against the sky. They'll keep looking, Lena said behind him. Elias turned. How many? 3, maybe more. On horseback? Lena nodded. Elias crossed his arms and leaned against the wall. 3 men on horseback, tracking a girl through the high country. They'll follow the trails, check the water sources, ask questions in town. They'll find me, Lena said, and her voice didn't waver. It was just a fact. The way the sun rises. The way storms come. Elias looked at her, this small, stubborn, half-dead girl who'd somehow survived 3 days alone in country that killed grown men. Not if I have anything to say about it, he said. Lena blinked. For the first time since she'd woken, something shifted in her expression. Not hope, exactly, but something close. Why? She asked. Elias pushed off the wall and moved back to the stove, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He took a long drink, letting the heat settle in his chest, and then he turned back to her. Because nobody deserves to be hunted, he said simply. And because you're here, and I'm here, and that means something. Lena stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly, she nodded. The days that followed were slow and careful. Elias kept Lena inside, away from the windows, away from anywhere she might be seen. He brought her food, dried meat, bread, canned beans, and made sure she drank enough water. The fever didn't come back, but she was weak, and it took time for her body to remember how to be strong again. She didn't talk much. Neither did he. But in the silence, something settled between them, an understanding that didn't need words. Elias learned things about her in small pieces. She'd grown up in a mining camp 2 territories over. Her father had died in a collapse. Her mother had tried to keep them afloat, but the debt had piled up, and eventually men had come with papers and promises and threats. Lena's mother had sent her running the night before they came to collect. She told me not to look back, Lena said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the peaks. She told me to run until I couldn't run anymore, and then to keep going. Elias didn't ask what had happened to her mother. He didn't need to. By the end of the first week, Lena was strong enough to walk the perimeter of the cabin. By the end of the second, she was helping Elias with small tasks, feeding the chickens, hauling water, mending a tear in one of his shirts. She didn't smile much, but sometimes, when the light hit just right and the wind carried the smell of pine and wildflowers, she'd pause and tilt her face toward the sun. And in those moments, she looked like what she was, a child. But the mountains didn't care about moments. The mountains cared about survival, and survival meant staying sharp. Elias taught her how to move quietly through the brush, how to read tracks in the dirt, how to find water when the streams ran dry. He showed her which plants were safe to eat and which would kill her. He taught her how to listen, not just for danger, but for the rhythm of the land itself. Lena learned fast, too fast, like she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to teach her how to stay alive. And then, on the 15th day, the dust came. Elias saw it first, a faint smudge on the eastern horizon, rising slow and steady like smoke. He was outside splitting wood when he caught the movement, and he stopped mid-swing, axe frozen in the air. Riders. He dropped the axe and moved quickly to the cabin, pushing open the door. Lena was inside, sitting at the table with a book he'd given her, a worn copy of something about birds. "They're here," Elias said. Lena looked up, and all the color drained from her face. "How many?" she asked. "Can't tell yet. At least 2, maybe 3. Lena stood, hands trembling. "What do we do?" Elias moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to see. The dust was closer now, and he could make out shapes, horses, riders, moving at a steady pace. Not rushing, not hunting, just coming. "We run," he said. Lena shook her head. "They'll catch us. They always catch us." Elias turned and looked at her, really looked at her, saw the fear in her eyes, the resignation, the part of her that had already decided this was how it ended. "Not this time," he said. He grabbed his rifle from above the door, shoved a handful of cartridges into his pocket, and slung a pack over his shoulder. Then he held out his hand. "Come on," he said. Lena stared at his hand. Then, slowly, she took it. They slipped out the back door and into the trees, moving fast and low, heading west toward the canyon where the land broke apart into a maze of rock and shadow. Behind them, the dust grew thicker, and the sound of hoofbeats began to echo across the hills. Elias didn't look back. He just kept moving, pulling Lena along, trusting the mountains to do what they'd always done: swallow people whole and never give them back. The canyon swallowed them whole within minutes. One moment they were running through open ground, lungs burning and legs pumping, and the next they were surrounded by walls of stone that rose up on either side like the ribs of some ancient beast. The air turned cooler here, shaded from the relentless sun, and their footsteps echoed strange and hollow against the rock. Elias didn't slow down. He kept his hand wrapped around Lena's wrist, pulling her forward even when she stumbled, even when her breathing turned ragged and desperate. Behind them, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder, closer, accompanied now by voices, men calling to each other, coordinating, spreading out to cover more ground. "How much farther?" Lena gasped. "Far enough," Elias said, though he didn't know if that was true. The canyon twisted and narrowed, forcing them to turn sideways in places where the walls pressed so close he could touch both sides at once. Overhead, the sky appeared as nothing more than a thin ribbon of blue, and the shadows deepened until it felt like they were moving through twilight, even though the sun still blazed somewhere above. They reached a fork where the canyon split in 3 directions. Elias paused, chest heaving, and scanned each path. The leftmost route climbed steeply upward, littered with loose shale that would slow them down and leave an obvious trail. The middle path looked wider, easier, which meant it was probably where the riders would expect them to go. The right path descended into darkness, narrow and treacherous, barely wide enough for a horse. "This way," Elias said, pulling Lena toward the right. "It's too dark," she said, voice tight with fear. "That's the point." They plunged into the shadows, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. The walls here wept moisture, and the ground beneath their feet turned slick with moss and algae. Lena slipped twice, and both times Elias caught her before she went down hard. His rifle banged against his back with every step, and the pack dug into his shoulders, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The path curved sharply to the left, then descended even more steeply, forcing them to half climb, half slide down sections of wet rock. Lena's dress snagged on something, and she yanked it free with a sound that was half sob, half snarl. Elias glanced back at her and saw blood on her hands where the rock had cut her palms. "Keep moving," he said, and his voice came out harder than he intended. Lena's eyes flashed with something, anger maybe, or defiance, but she nodded and kept going. They emerged from the narrow passage into a wider basin where sunlight slanted down through gaps in the rock above. A thin stream trickled across the basin floor, pooling in shallow depressions before disappearing into cracks in the stone. Elias knelt beside the stream, filled his canteen, and passed it to Lena. "Drink," he said. "Not too fast." Lena took the canteen with shaking hands and drank in small, careful sips. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt and sweat, and her eyes had the glassy look of someone running on fumes. "We can't stay here," Elias said, scanning the basin. The walls rose up on all sides, but there were gaps, places where the rock had crumbled or where erosion had carved out passages. 3 exits, maybe 4. Too many options. Too many ways for the riders to circle around and trap them. "How do you know they won't find us?" Lena asked. "I don't," Elias admitted. He stood and slung the pack back over his shoulder. "But I know this country better than they do, and I know how to disappear." "For how long?" Elias looked at her. "As long as it takes." They moved again, this time heading west through a gap in the basin wall that led into a series of interconnected gullies. The ground here was dry and cracked, covered in a fine layer of dust that rose up with every step and coated their throats until breathing felt like swallowing sand. The heat pressed down from above, relentless and suffocating, and Elias could feel sweat running down his back in rivers. He'd been in the high country long enough to know that summer was the cruelest season. Winter killed you fast, quick and clean, hypothermia shutting down your body before you even realized you were dying. But summer took its time. It stripped you down piece by piece, dehydrating you, baking you, wearing away your strength until you made mistakes. And mistakes out here meant death. They walked for hours, stopping only when Lena couldn't go any farther without rest. Each time they stopped, Elias scanned the horizon, listening for hoofbeats, watching for dust. But the land remained still, empty, offering no clues about whether they were being followed or whether they'd managed to slip away. By late afternoon, they reached the edge of a dry ravine where the land dropped away into a maze of eroded channels and wind-carved stone. Elias stood at the rim and stared down into the labyrinth below, mind working through possibilities. The ravine would provide cover, but it would also slow them down. If the riders found them down there, there'd be no escape. "Are we going down?" Lena asked. Elias nodded. "We don't have a choice." They descended carefully, using hand and footholds carved by centuries of runoff. Halfway down, Lena's foot slipped, and she slid several feet before catching herself on a jutting rock. Elias climbed down to her and found her gripping the stone so hard her knuckles had gone white. "I've got you," he said, positioning himself below her. "Let go and I'll catch you." Lena looked down at him, eyes wide with terror. "Trust me," Elias said. She let go. He caught her, absorbing the impact with his legs, and they both went down hard in a tangle of limbs and dust. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Elias pushed himself up and offered Lena his hand. "You all right?" he asked. Lena nodded, though her hands were shaking worse than before. They continued down into the ravine, and the world narrowed to walls of striated stone that showed layers of time, rust red, bone white, charcoal black. The air here felt trapped, thick and heavy, and the silence had weight. No birds, no insects, just the sound of their breathing and the scuff of their boots on stone. Elias led them through the maze, choosing paths at random, doubling back when they hit dead ends, always moving deeper into the heart of the ravine. He knew they were leaving tracks, scuff marks on the rock, disturbed dust, broken spiderwebs, but he was counting on the wind to erase some of it, and on the complexity of the terrain to confuse anyone trying to follow. They found shelter as the sun began to set. A shallow cave carved into the ravine wall, barely deep enough to be called a cave at all, but enough to keep them hidden from anyone passing by. Elias crawled inside first, checked for snakes and scorpions, and then motioned for Lena to follow. She crawled in beside him, and they sat with their backs against the stone, knees drawn up, shoulders touching. The cave smelled like dust and something ancient, and the stone still radiated heat from the day's sun. "Are they still out there?" Lena whispered. "Probably," Elias said. "What if they find us? Then I'll deal with it." Lena turned her head to look at him, and in the fading light, her face was all shadows and sharp angles. "Why are you doing this, she asked. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Elias was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the strip of sky visible between the ravine walls. The stars were beginning to appear, faint at first, then brighter as the darkness deepened. "I had a daughter once," he said finally. Lena went very still. "She was about your age, maybe a little younger." Elias's voice was low, rough, like something dragged over gravel. "There was a fever that came through the valley, took half the children in 3 weeks, took her." "I'm sorry," Lena whispered. Elias shook his head. "I couldn't help her, couldn't stop it, couldn't do a damn thing but watch her slip away." He paused, swallowed hard. "But I can help you. So that's what I'm going to do." Lena didn't say anything. She just reached out and took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his calloused palm, and they sat like that as the night came down around them, and the stars wheeled overhead in their silent, unchanging patterns. They slept in shifts, or tried to. Elias took the first watch, sitting at the mouth of the cave with his rifle across his knees, listening to the night sounds, the distant yip of coyotes, the flutter of bats overhead, the occasional skitter of something small moving through the rocks. When exhaustion finally pulled him under, Lena took over, her eyes wide and unblinking in the darkness, watching for movement, listening for the sound of hoofbeats. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening from black to deep purple to pale gray. Elias woke with his neck stiff and his mouth tasting like copper. Lena was still awake, still watching, and when he touched her shoulder, she flinched so hard she nearly cracked her head on the cave ceiling. "Easy," Elias said. "It's just me." Lena exhaled shakily and lowered her head into her hands. "I thought I heard something," she said. "Voices. Maybe. I don't know." Elias crawled to the mouth of the cave and looked out. The ravine was empty, silent, the morning light turning the stone walls shades of amber and gold. But that didn't mean they were alone. Sound traveled strange in the canyons, bouncing off walls, carrying for miles, making it impossible to judge distance or direction. "We need to keep moving," he said. They crawled out of the cave and continued deeper into the ravine, moving as quietly as possible. The heat was already building, the sun climbing higher, turning the stone into an oven. By mid-morning, the temperature was brutal, and Elias could feel the moisture being pulled from his body with every breath. He rationed the water carefully, giving Lena more than himself, watching for signs of heat stroke, confusion, dizziness, nausea. She was holding up better than he'd expected, but he could see the toll it was taking. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her eyes had a sunken look that came from dehydration. They found another stream in the early afternoon, barely more than a seep coming from a crack in the rock, and they stopped to refill the canteen and soak their neckerchiefs in the cool water. Lena pressed the wet cloth to her face and neck, and some of the tension left her shoulders. "How much farther?" she asked. "To where?" "Anywhere that isn't here." Elias smiled grimly. "Another day. Maybe 2. There's a settlement on the other side of the mountain. Small place. We can disappear there." "You think they'll give up?" "I think they'll get tired of chasing ghosts." But even as he said it, Elias wasn't sure he believed it. Men like the ones hunting Lena didn't give up easy. They had too much invested: money, pride, the belief that the world owed them whatever they wanted. They'd keep coming until they found her, or until something stopped them. They rested in the shade of an overhang for an hour, and then they pushed on. The ravine eventually opened into a wider valley where scrub brush and stunted juniper trees clung to life in the sandy soil. The landscape here was more forgiving, but it was also more exposed. Elias moved carefully, keeping to the low ground, using whatever cover he could find. They were halfway across the valley when Lena grabbed his arm and pointed. "There," she whispered. Elias followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. On the ridge above them, silhouetted against the sky, were 3 riders. They were too far away to make out details, but close enough that Elias could see them clearly, men on horseback, moving slow and deliberate, scanning the valley below. "Get down," Elias hissed, pulling Lena behind a clump of sagebrush. They crouched in the dirt, barely breathing, and watched as the riders moved along the ridge. One of them stopped and pointed down toward the valley. The others reined in their horses and looked where he was pointing. Elias's hand went to his rifle, and his mind raced through options. They were too exposed here. If the riders came down into the valley, there'd be nowhere to hide. But if they tried to run now, they'd be spotted for sure. "What do we do?" Lena breathed. "We wait," Elias said, "and we pray they don't look too close." The riders stayed on the ridge for what felt like an eternity. One of them dismounted and knelt, studying the ground. Elias's pulse hammered in his ears, and sweat ran down his face in streams. Beside him, Lena was trembling, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Finally, the rider stood and remounted. He said something to the others, and they turned their horses and continued along the ridge, moving away from the valley. Elias didn't move until they were out of sight. Then he exhaled slowly and looked at Lena. "We need to go," he said. "Now." They ran. Not the careful, measured pace they'd maintained before, but a flat-out sprint driven by adrenaline and fear. They crossed the valley in minutes and plunged into a stand of juniper trees on the far side, pushing through the low branches until they reached another canyon mouth. Elias didn't stop to check if they were being followed. He just kept moving, pulling Lena along, trusting his instincts and the land to guide them. The canyon walls rose up again, narrower this time, and the path became treacherous, loose rock that shifted underfoot, sudden drops that forced them to climb down carefully. sections where the walls pressed so close they had to turn sideways to squeeze through. They were halfway through when Lena's foot caught on something, and she went down hard. Elias heard the crack of bone against stone, heard her cry out, and he spun around to find her on the ground, clutching her ankle. "Lena, I'm fine," she gasped, but her face had gone white, and when she tried to stand, her leg buckled. Elias knelt beside her and carefully pulled her hand away from her ankle. It was already swelling, turning dark with bruising. Not broken, he thought, but badly sprained. Maybe worse. "Can you walk?" he asked. Lena tried again and managed to stand, but the moment she put weight on the injured ankle, she cried out and would have fallen if Elias hadn't caught her. "All right," he said, making a decision. "New plan." He shifted the rifle and pack, then crouched down in front of her. "Climb on." "What?" "On my back. I'll carry you." "You can't." "Yes, I can. Now get on before those riders circle back and find us." Lena hesitated, then wrapped her arms around his neck. Elias stood, hooking his arms under her legs, and started walking. She weighed more than she had when he'd first found her, and that was a good sign. It meant she was recovering, getting stronger. But it also meant carrying her was going to be harder than he'd thought. He pushed the discomfort aside and focused on moving forward. One step, then another. The canyon narrowed and darkened, and the walls closed in until he could barely see the sky. His shoulders burned and his legs trembled with the effort, but he didn't stop. Behind him, Lena's breathing gradually steadied. Her grip loosened slightly, and she rested her forehead against his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias didn't answer. He just kept walking, deeper into the canyon, deeper into the maze, carrying the weight of a girl who'd already lost too much and couldn't afford to lose anything more. They emerged from the canyon as the sun was setting, the light turning everything gold and red and impossibly beautiful. Ahead, the land opened into rolling hills covered in tall grass that swayed in the evening breeze. And beyond the hills, barely visible through the haze, was the faint outline of buildings. The settlement. "We made it," Lena breathed. Elias set her down carefully, keeping one arm around her waist to steady her. Together they stood at the edge of the canyon and looked out at the land stretching before them, vast and open and full of possibility. But Elias didn't let himself relax. Not yet. Because somewhere behind them, 3 men were still searching, and Summer still had weeks left to burn. They didn't head straight for the settlement. Elias knew better than that. Instead, he led Lena along the base of the hills, keeping to the tall grass where their movement would be harder to spot from a distance. The grass came up to his chest in places, golden and dry, rustling with every step. Lena limped beside him, one hand gripping his arm for balance, her injured ankle unable to bear much weight. The sun dropped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the temperature finally began to ease. A breeze picked up from the west, carrying the smell of wood smoke and something else. Cooking meat, maybe, or fresh bread. Signs of civilization. Signs of people living ordinary lives while Elias and Lena ran for theirs. "We can't just walk in there," Lena said, voice strained with pain and exhaustion. "What if they're already there? What if they're asking questions?" "Then we'll know," Elias said. "And we'll leave." "And go where?" Elias didn't have an answer for that. He just kept walking, eyes scanning the horizon, watching for movement, listening for the sound of hoofbeats. The settlement grew closer, taking shape in the fading light. Maybe 24 buildings scattered along both sides of a dirt road, a church with a crooked steeple at one end, a general store at the other, a few houses with lanterns already burning in the windows. They stopped at the edge of the settlement, hidden in the tall grass, and watched. People moved between the buildings, a woman carrying a basket, a man leading a mule, children chasing each other in the dusty street. Normal, peaceful, the kind of scene that would have been comforting under different circumstances. Elias studied each person carefully, looking for anything out of place. Strangers, men on horseback, anyone paying too much attention to the road or scanning the hills beyond town. "I don't see them," Lena whispered. "That doesn't mean they're not here." They waited as the sky darkened and the stars began to appear. One by one, the lanterns in the windows went out, and the street emptied. The settlement settled into sleep, quiet except for the occasional bark of a dog or the creak of a shutter in the wind. "We need shelter," Elias said finally, "and we need to get that ankle looked at." "Where?" Elias pointed to a building at the far end of town, a small house set back from the road, partially hidden by a stand of cottonwood trees. No light in the windows, no smoke from the chimney. It looked empty, or at least unoccupied. "There," he said. "We'll wait until everyone's asleep, then we'll see if we can get inside." "What if someone lives there?" "Then we'll apologize and move on." They waited another hour until the settlement had gone completely dark, and the only sound was the wind moving through the grass. Then Elias helped Lena to her feet, and they made their way toward the house, moving slowly, carefully, stopping every few yards to listen. The house was small and weathered, the kind of place that had seen better days. The front door hung slightly crooked on its hinges, and one of the windows had been boarded over. Elias tested the door and found it unlocked. He pushed it open, and the hinges groaned loud enough to make him wince. Inside, the house was dark and smelled like dust and old wood. Elias waited for his eyes to adjust, then moved carefully through the front room. There was a table, a couple of chairs, a cold stove in the corner. No signs of recent occupation, no personal belongings, just empty space. "It's abandoned," Lena said from behind him. "Looks that way." Elias closed the door and moved to one of the windows, peering out through a gap in the boards. The street remained empty. No movement, no signs that anyone had noticed them. He turned back to find Lena already sitting in one of the chairs, her injured ankle propped on the other chair, her face pale with exhaustion. In the faint moonlight coming through the window, she looked small and fragile and far too young to have survived everything she'd been through. "Let me see your ankle," Elias said. Lena hesitated, then carefully pulled up the hem of her dress. The ankle had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, and the bruising had spread up her calf in shades of purple and black. Elias knelt beside her and gently probed the swelling with his fingers. Lena hissed in pain but didn't pull away. "It's not broken," he said after a moment. "But it's a bad sprain. You need to stay off it for a few days." "We don't have a few days." "We'll make do." Elias stood and moved to the back of the house, searching through the abandoned rooms. He found a few pieces of cloth in what must have once been a bedroom, and he brought them back to the front room. He soaked one piece in water from his canteen and wrapped it around Lena's ankle, then used the dry cloth to secure it in place. "That'll help with the swelling," he said, "but you need real rest, real food." "And where are we supposed to get that?" Elias moved back to the window and looked out at the settlement. "I'll go into town tomorrow, see what I can find out, see if anyone's asking questions about a girl." "They'll recognize you." "Not if I'm careful," Lena shook her head. "It's too dangerous." "Everything's dangerous right now," Elias said. "But we can't keep running on empty. We need supplies, we need information, and we need to know if those men are still out there." Lena opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. She looked down at her hands, at the cuts and bruises that covered her palms, and something shifted in her expression. Not resignation exactly, more like acceptance. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said quietly. "I promise." They spent the night in the abandoned house, taking turns keeping watch. Elias slept fitfully, waking every hour to check the windows, to listen for sounds that didn't belong. Each time he woke, he found Lena still awake, staring at the ceiling, lost in thoughts she didn't share. When dawn came, Elias prepared to go into town. He left the rifle with Lena, along with most of their remaining supplies. "If anyone comes," he said, "anyone at all, you hide. There's a crawl space under the floorboards in the back room. You get in there and you don't come out until you're sure it's me." "How will I know it's you?" Elias thought for a moment. "I'll whistle. 3 short, 1 long, like a meadowlark." Lena nodded, fingers wrapped tight around the rifle. Elias stepped out into the early morning light and made his way toward the center of town. The settlement was already stirring, doors opening, people emerging to start their day. He kept his head down, his hat pulled low, and walked with the purposeful stride of someone who belonged. The general store was open, and Elias went inside. The proprietor was an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and a bushy mustache that twitched when he talked. "Help you?" he asked. "Need some supplies," Elias said. "Flour, salt, dried meat if you have it." Bandages. The proprietor nodded and began gathering items from the shelves. Passing through? Something like that. Where you headed? North, Elias said, keeping his answers vague. Got a claim up in the high country. Rough country up there this time of year, hot as blazes. It is. The proprietor wrapped the supplies in brown paper and tied them with string. That'll be $3. Elias paid, then hesitated. You seen any strangers come through recently? Last few days, maybe? The proprietor's eyes narrowed slightly. Strangers? What kind of strangers? Men on horseback, 3 of them, maybe. Well-dressed, might have been asking questions. The proprietor set the package on the counter and crossed his arms. Why do you want to know? Elias chose his words carefully. Just curious, man likes to know who's sharing the road. For a long moment, the proprietor didn't say anything. Then he leaned forward slightly and lowered his voice. 3 men came through yesterday evening, he said. Riding good horses, city clothes. They were asking about a girl. Said she was a runaway. Said they had legal papers giving them custody. Elias felt ice settle in his chest. They say where they were headed? North, same direction you're going. The proprietor paused. They also said there was a reward for information. $50 for anyone who'd seen her. $50? Elias repeated. That's a lot of money. It is. Elias picked up the package and tipped his hat. Appreciate the information. He was halfway to the door when the proprietor spoke again. They also said she might be traveling with someone, he said. A man, older, mountain type. Elias stopped but didn't turn around. Said if anyone saw them both, they should send word immediately, the proprietor continued. Said the man was dangerous, possibly armed. Elias turned slowly and met the proprietor's gaze. The older man's expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, assessing. That's interesting, Elias said carefully. Thought you might think so. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then the proprietor picked up a rag and began wiping down the counter, his movements deliberate and unhurried. If I were a betting man, he said, not looking at Elias, I'd say those men were lying about the papers. I'd say they were the kind of men who think money gives them the right to own people. Elias didn't respond. I'd also say, the proprietor continued, that if someone were helping that girl, they'd need to be real careful, because those men aren't going to give up, and they've got the law on their side, whether the law knows it or not. Appreciate the advice, Elias said. The proprietor looked up and met his eyes again. There's a trail that runs west from here, follows the river for about 20 miles, then splits. North Fork goes back into the mountains. South Fork heads toward the territorial line. If someone wanted to disappear, the South Fork would be the way to go. Elias nodded once. I'll keep that in mind. He left the store and made his way back through the settlement, moving quickly but not running, aware of the eyes that followed him from doorways and windows. The proprietor's words echoed in his mind. Those men aren't going to give up. And he knew with absolute certainty that the next move he made would determine whether Lena lived or died. He was almost back to the abandoned house when he saw them. 3 riders coming down the main street at an easy walk, their horses fresh and well-fed. The men wore suits and had the clean-shaven look of people who'd never done a day of real work in their lives. The one in the middle carried himself with an air of authority, and when he turned his head to survey the street, Elias caught a glimpse of a badge pinned to his vest. Not just bounty hunters. Law. Elias ducked behind a water trough and watched as the riders passed. They stopped at the general store, and the man with the badge dismounted and went inside. The other 2 stayed on their horses, eyes scanning the settlement with the cold, methodical precision of men trained to notice things. Elias waited until they were focused on something else, then slipped around the back of the nearest building and made his way to the abandoned house. He gave the meadowlark whistle, 3 short, 1 long, and heard movement inside. Lena opened the door, rifle in hand, face tight with fear. They're here, Elias said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. In town. Right now. Lena's face went white. What do we do? We leave. Now. I can barely walk. Then I'll carry you. Elias grabbed the pack, slung the rifle over his shoulder, and crouched down. Lena climbed onto his back, wrapping her arms around his neck, and Elias stood with a grunt of effort. They slipped out the back door and into the cottonwood trees, moving as quickly and quietly as possible. Behind them, the settlement continued its morning routine, unaware that two fugitives were fleeing through the shadows. Elias headed west, following the trail the proprietor had mentioned. The river ran parallel to the path, wide and shallow, its water clear enough to see the smooth stones on the bottom. The sound of it covered their footsteps, and the trees provided cover from anyone watching from the settlement. They'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when Elias heard voices behind them. He stopped, breathing hard, and turned to look back through the trees. The three riders had left the settlement and were following the trail. They weren't moving fast, just a steady walk, but they were coming, and they were gaining. "They're tracking us," Lena whispered. "I know." Elias shifted her weight and started moving again, faster now, pushing through the pain in his shoulders and legs. The trail began to climb, following the river upstream into rougher country. The trees thinned out, replaced by scrub brush and exposed rock. The voices behind them grew louder. Elias's mind raced through options. They could hide, but Lena's ankle made it impossible for her to move quietly through the brush. They could try to outrun the riders, but on foot, carrying Lena, he'd never manage it. They could stand and fight, but three armed men against one tired mountain man weren't good odds. That left one option. Elias veered off the trail and headed straight for the river. The water here ran faster, deeper, channeled through a narrow gorge carved into the bedrock. He could hear it roaring ahead of them, see the spray rising into the air where it crashed over rocks and fallen logs. "What are you doing?" Lena asked, voice rising with panic. "Trust me," Elias said. He reached the edge of the gorge and looked down. The river churned 30 feet below, white with foam, littered with boulders and debris. Upstream, the water ran calmer, pooling in wide eddies before being sucked into the gorge. Elias moved upstream, searching for a way down. He found a narrow path that switched back along the gorge wall, steep and treacherous, barely wide enough for one person. Behind them, the voices grew closer. Elias could make out words now, instructions being called back and forth, the sound of horses being dismounted. "Hold on tight," Elias said, and he started down the path. The descent was brutal. Loose rocks shifted underfoot, and twice he nearly lost his balance and pitched forward over the edge. Lena's grip around his neck tightened until he could barely breathe, but he didn't tell her to ease up. If she fell, she'd tumble straight into the gorge, and that would be the end. They were halfway down when a voice called out from above, "Stop right there!" Elias looked up and saw one of the riders standing at the top of the gorge, rifle in hand. The man raised the weapon to his shoulder. "I said stop!" Elias didn't stop. He kept moving, half climbing, half sliding down the path. A gunshot cracked through the air, and rock exploded inches from his head. He felt Lena flinch against his back, heard her whimper, but he didn't slow down. Another shot. This one went wide, ricocheting off the gorge wall and disappearing into the river below. Elias reached the bottom and stumbled onto a narrow strip of rock beside the churning water. He set Lena down and pulled the rifle from his shoulder. "Get behind me," he said. Lena crawled behind a boulder and Elias crouched beside her, rifle raised. He could see the man at the top of the gorge, could see him taking aim again. Elias fired first. The shot went high, intentionally. He didn't want to kill anyone if he could avoid it, but he needed them to know he was armed and willing to shoot back. The man at the top ducked behind cover, and for a moment there was silence except for the roar of the river. Then a voice called down, calm and controlled. The man with the badge. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "The girl belongs to the Hawthorne Mining Company. She's got a contract to fulfill, legal and binding." "She's a child," Elias shouted back. "She's property, and you're interfering with lawful recovery." "There's nothing lawful about owning people." "That's not for you to decide." Another shot rang out, and this one struck the boulder inches from Lena's head. She screamed and pressed herself flat against the rock. Elias returned fire, and this time he aimed lower. The bullet struck the ground near the man's feet, sending up a spray of dirt and stone. The shooting stopped. "We can do this all day," the voice called down. "But you're trapped down there. Eventually you'll run out of ammunition, or patience, and when you do, we'll be waiting." Elias knew he was right. The gorge was a dead end. The only way out was back up the path, and the riders controlled the high ground. He looked at the river, at the white water churning through the gorge, and an idea began to form. A desperate, probably suicidal idea. But it was the only one he had. "Can you swim?" he asked Lena. She stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "What? Can you swim?" "A little. But that water—" "I know, but it's the only way." Elias scanned the gorge downstream. The white water ran for maybe 100 yards before the river widened and calmed. If they could make it through that section without being dashed against the rocks, they might have a chance. He pulled off his boots and emptied his pockets, keeping only the bare essentials. Then he helped Lena do the same. "Listen to me," he said, gripping her shoulders. "We're going to jump in together. I'll hold on to you the whole time. Don't fight the current. Let it carry you. Keep your head up and your feet forward. If you hit a rock, push off and keep moving. Understand?" Lena's eyes were huge with terror, but she nodded. "On 3, Elias said. He took her hand, pulled her to the edge of the rock, and looked down at the churning water below. 1, 2. A gunshot cracked, and water sprayed up beside them. 3. They jumped. The cold hit first, a shock so complete it drove the air from Elias's lungs. Then the current seized them, violent and indifferent, pulling them under before he could take a proper breath. Water filled his mouth, his nose, his ears, and the world became a chaos of white foam and crushing pressure. He felt Lena's hand slip from his grip, felt her being torn away by the current, and panic flooded through him with the same force as the river. He kicked hard, fighting toward where he thought the surface was, and his head broke through just long enough to gulp air before the current dragged him under again. This time he kept his eyes open, ignoring the sting of the water, searching for Lena in the churning whiteness. He caught a flash of fabric, a glimpse of her pale face, and he lunged for her, fingers closing around her arm just as the river slammed them both into a boulder. The impact drove the breath from his body, and for a moment everything went dark at the edges. But he didn't let go. He couldn't let go. He pulled Lena close, wrapping one arm around her chest, and with the other he pushed off the rock, sending them spinning back into the main channel. The gorge walls blurred past on either side, and the roar of the water was so loud it drowned out everything else. Thought, fear, even the knowledge that they were probably going to die. Elias just held Lena tight and let the river take them, keeping her head above water when he could, shielding her body with his own when they struck rocks or submerged logs. Time lost all meaning. It could have been seconds or minutes or hours. All Elias knew was the cold, the violence of the current, and the desperate need to keep Lena alive. Then, gradually, the gorge began to widen. The walls pulled back, the water spread out, and the current eased. Elias felt his feet scrape bottom, felt solid ground beneath him, and he staggered upright, still clutching Lena, and stumbled toward the nearest bank. They collapsed together on a strip of muddy sand, coughing up river water, gasping for air. Elias rolled onto his back and stared up at the sky, chest heaving, every muscle in his body screaming. Beside him, Lena was curled on her side, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. For a long time, neither of them moved. They just lay there, too exhausted to do anything but breathe. Finally, Elias pushed himself up onto his elbows and looked around. They'd been carried nearly a quarter-mile downstream from where they'd jumped. The gorge was behind them now, and the river had widened into a broad, shallow stretch dotted with sandbars and stands of willow. The sun was higher, burning hot despite the chill of the water, and steam was already rising from their wet clothes. "Lena," Elias said, voice hoarse. "You all right?" Lena didn't answer right away. She just lay there, staring at nothing, her breathing ragged and uneven. Elias crawled over to her and gently rolled her onto her back. Her eyes were open, but they had the glassy, unfocused look of someone in shock. "Hey," he said, cupping her face with his hands. "Look at me. You're all right. We made it." Lena blinked, and slowly her eyes focused on his face. "We're alive?" she whispered. "We're alive." A sound escaped her that was half laugh, half sob, and she pressed her hands to her face and started crying. Not the quiet, controlled tears of someone trying to hold it together, but deep, racking sobs that shook her whole body. Elias pulled her into his arms and held her, one hand on the back of her head, letting her cry it out. She clung to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that kept trying to destroy her, and he didn't say anything. Didn't tell her it was going to be okay because he didn't know if it was. He just held her and let her feel what she needed to feel. When the crying finally subsided, Lena pulled back and wiped her face with the back of her hand. Her eyes were red and swollen, but some of the glassiness had faded. "I thought we were going to die," she said. "So did I. But you jumped anyway." "Didn't have much choice." Lena looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression. Not gratitude exactly. Something deeper. Something that recognized what it meant for a person to risk everything for someone they barely knew. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why do you keep doing this?" Elias looked away, out at the river still flowing past, indifferent to their survival. "Because someone has to," he said finally. "And because if I don't, I'm no better than the men chasing you." Lena nodded slowly, like she understood something she hadn't before. Elias got to his feet and helped Lena stand. Her ankle was worse now, the swelling had increased, and she couldn't put any weight on it at all without crying out in pain. He fashioned a makeshift crutch from a sturdy piece of driftwood, but even with support, every step was agony. They needed to move, though. The riders would be looking for them downstream, and it wouldn't take long before they picked up the trail. "Can you make it?" Elias asked. Lena gritted her teeth and nodded. "I don't have a choice either." They started walking, following the river downstream but staying back in the willow thickets where the cover was thicker. The going was slow, and every sound made Elias's hand drift to where his rifle should have been before he remembered he'd lost it in the river. He was unarmed now, with no way to defend them if the riders caught up. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature rose with it. Steam continued to rise from their wet clothes, and within an hour they were dry but covered in a fine layer of dried mud and river silt. Lena's face was flushed with fever again. Not the same as before, but a new heat brought on by exhaustion and pain and the constant stress of running. They stopped to rest in the shade of a large cottonwood, and Elias wetted his neckerchief in the river and pressed it to Lena's forehead. "We can't keep going like this," she said. "I'm slowing you down." "You're doing fine." "I'm not." "You know I'm not." She looked up at him, eyes clear and steady despite the fever. "You should leave me. Find somewhere safe and come back when it's—" "No." "Elias." "No," he said again, and his voice was harder than he'd intended. "I'm not leaving you. Not for an hour, not for a minute. We stay together or we don't make it at all." Lena stared at him, and for a moment he thought she was going to argue, but then she just nodded and leaned back against the tree trunk, closing her eyes. They rested for another 20 minutes, then pushed on. The river began to bend south, curving away from the mountains and into flatter country where the trees grew taller and the grass turned from brown to green. Elias recognized the change. They were getting close to the territorial line, to the place where one set of laws ended and another began. If they could make it across, the riders would have a harder time following. Not impossible, but harder. And right now, every bit of distance mattered. They walked through the afternoon, stopping only when Lena absolutely couldn't continue. Each rest period grew longer, and each time they started moving again, it took more effort to get Lena on her feet. Her ankle had swollen to grotesque proportions, and the skin had turned a mottled purple-black that made Elias's stomach turn. She needed a doctor. Real medicine. Rest and care and all the things they didn't have and couldn't get without exposing themselves. As the sun began to set, they reached a place where the river widened into a series of connected pools separated by low stone dams. The water here was calm and clear, and fish darted through the shallows in silver flashes. On the far bank, barely visible through the trees, was a structure. Small, weathered, possibly abandoned. Elias studied it carefully, watching for signs of life. No smoke from a chimney, no movement in the windows, no horses or wagons nearby. "Wait here," he told Lena, and he waded across the river, keeping low, moving carefully through the underbrush on the far side. The structure was a cabin, even smaller than his place in the high country. The door hung open, and when Elias peered inside, he found exactly what he'd hoped for: an abandoned homestead, left behind when whoever had built it either moved on or died. There was a table, a broken chair, a stone fireplace caked with old ash. And in the corner, covered with a rotting tarp, were supplies. Canned goods, a few tools, a bundle of old blankets. Elias checked the area around the cabin, making sure they were alone, then waded back across the river to get Lena. "There's shelter," he said. "Nothing fancy, but it's better than sleeping in the open." He carried her across the river and into the cabin, settling her on the pile of blankets after shaking out the worst of the dust and mouse droppings. Then he went back outside and gathered wood for a fire, checking constantly over his shoulder for signs of pursuit. By the time full dark had fallen, he had a small fire going in the fireplace and was heating water in a dented pot he'd found among the supplies. Lena sat propped against the wall, watching him work, her face drawn with exhaustion. "We can't stay here long," she said. "I know, but you need rest, and I need to figure out our next move. What if they find us? Then we'll deal with it." Elias poured the heated water into a cloth and carefully unwrapped the makeshift bandage around Lena's ankle. The skin beneath was hot to the touch, and he could see red streaks starting to spread up her calf. Infection, setting in fast. He cleaned the ankle as gently as he could, then rewrapped it with a fresh piece of cloth. Lena bit down on her lip the whole time, tears streaming silently down her face, but she didn't make a sound. When he was finished, Elias sat back and looked at her. "I'm not going to lie to you," he said. "That ankle needs proper medical attention. If we don't get it treated soon, you could lose the foot, maybe worse." "Then we need to cross the territorial line," Lena said. "Get far enough away that those men can't follow. Find a town where nobody knows us. That's at least another day's walk, maybe 2, with your ankle." "Then we'd better get started at first light." Elias studied her face, the stubborn set of her jaw, the determination in her eyes despite the pain and exhaustion. She'd been running for so long, endured so much, and still she refused to quit. It was the kind of strength that couldn't be taught, only earned through suffering. "All right," he said. "We leave at dawn. But tonight, you rest. Really rest. I'll keep watch." Lena started to protest, but exhaustion won out. Within minutes, she was asleep, curled on her side, breathing deep and even. Elias moved to the doorway and sat with his back against the frame, staring out into the darkness. The night was quiet except for the sound of the river and the occasional call of an owl hunting in the trees. Stars filled the sky in impossible numbers, and a half-moon cast silver light across the landscape. He thought about his daughter again, as he often did in the quiet hours. Thought about how she'd loved stars, how she'd made him tell her stories about the constellations, even though he didn't know most of their names. Thought about how she'd trusted him completely, believed he could fix anything, protect her from anything, and how he'd failed. He couldn't fail Lena, not after everything they'd been through, not when they were so close to making it. Sometime deep in the night, Elias heard something that made him go completely still. Voices, distant but distinct, carried on the wind, and beneath the voices the sound of horses moving through the trees. He slipped back into the cabin and knelt beside Lena, one hand over her mouth to muffle any sound when he woke her. Her eyes flew open, wide with fear. "They're here," Elias whispered. "We have to go. Now." Lena nodded, and Elias removed his hand. She pushed herself upright, biting back a cry of pain when her ankle shifted, and Elias helped her to her feet. They slipped out the back of the cabin, moving as quietly as possible through the darkness. Behind them, Elias could see lights now, lanterns, maybe 3 or 4 of them, bobbing through the trees as the riders spread out to search. He led Lena toward the river, but instead of crossing, he turned and followed the bank downstream, away from the cabin, using the sound of the water to cover their movement. The ground here was rocky and uneven, and twice Lena stumbled and would have fallen if Elias hadn't caught her. The voices grew louder, and Elias could make out words now. "Check the cabin. They were here recently. Fire's still warm." "Spread out. They can't have gone far." "Watch the river. They might try to cross again." Elias pulled Lena into a thick stand of brush and held her close, both of them barely breathing. Through the branches, he could see the lanterns moving closer, searching methodically, missing nothing. One of the riders passed within 10 feet of where they hid, so close Elias could hear the creak of saddle leather and the jingle of spurs. The man held his lantern high, sweeping it back and forth, and the light played across the brush where they were hiding. Elias felt Lena tense, felt her preparing to run or scream or do something that would give them away. He tightened his grip and brought his lips close to her ear. "Don't move," he breathed. "Don't even breathe." The rider stopped, and for an agonizing moment, Elias was certain they'd been spotted. But then the man turned and called out to one of the others. "Nothing over here. Heading back to the cabin." The light moved away, and Elias felt Lena sag against him, trembling violently. They stayed hidden for what felt like hours but was probably closer to 30 minutes, listening as the riders searched the area around the cabin, argued about which direction to go next, and finally mounted up and rode off to the south. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely did Elias allow himself to relax. "We need to move," he whispered. "Different direction. They'll be watching the river and the south trail." "Where do we go?" Elias looked north toward the mountains they'd come from, then west, toward territory he didn't know. Both directions held danger. Both directions held uncertainty. But west also held the territorial line, and beyond that the possibility of freedom. "West," he said. "We keep going west." They emerged from the brush and started walking, staying off the main trails, moving through country that grew rougher with each mile. The moon set, and the darkness became absolute, forcing them to feel their way forward step by step, trusting instinct more than sight. Lena was barely conscious now, fever raging, ankle infected badly enough that Elias could smell it, sweet and rotten, the smell of tissue dying. She leaned heavily on him, and several times she simply stopped moving, her body shutting down, refusing to take another step. Each time, Elias coaxed her forward. Dawn found them in open country, the mountains behind them, a vast expanse of rolling grassland stretching ahead. The territorial marker was visible in the distance, a line of stones placed at regular intervals, marking where one jurisdiction ended and another began. They'd made it. Elias helped Lena forward, one agonizing step at a time, until they crossed the line and stood on the far side. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, swaying with exhaustion, staring back at the land they'd fled. "Is it over?" Lena whispered. Elias looked at her, at the girl who'd survived things that would have broken most adults, and he wished he could tell her yes. Wished he could promise that crossing an invisible line would solve everything. But he'd learned long ago that the world didn't work that way. "Not yet," he said honestly, "but we're closer than we were." In the distance, barely visible through the morning haze, was the outline of buildings. Another settlement, larger than the last one, and where there were people, there might be help. Elias adjusted his grip on Lena and started walking toward those distant buildings, each step taking them farther from the men who hunted them and closer to whatever came next. The settlement appeared gradually through the morning haze, first as dark shapes against the pale sky, then as distinct structures with walls and roofs and windows that caught the early sunlight. It was larger than the last town, sprawling across both sides of a wide creek that cut through the grassland like a silver thread. Elias counted at least 40 buildings, maybe more, and he could see people already moving in the streets despite the early hour. Lena had stopped talking an hour ago. She hung limp against his side, barely conscious, her breath coming in shallow gasps that rattled in her chest. The fever had spiked during the night, and now her skin burned so hot it scared him. He'd seen infection take hold before, knew how fast it could turn deadly, and the knowledge pushed him forward even when his own legs threatened to buckle. They reached the outskirts of town just as the sun cleared the eastern horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. A woman was hanging laundry in her yard, and she stopped mid-motion when she saw them, her mouth falling open at the sight of a mud-covered man carrying a half-dead girl. "Please," Elias called out, voice cracking from exhaustion and thirst. "Is there a doctor?" The woman dropped her laundry basket and hurried toward them. "Mercy," she breathed, looking at Lena's swollen ankle and flushed face. "What happened?" "Accident," Elias said, which wasn't entirely a lie. "We've been traveling for days. She needs help." The woman didn't ask more questions. She just pointed down the main street. "Dr. Haversham, third building past the general store, blue door. Can you make it?" "I'll make it." Elias stumbled forward, following her directions, aware of the eyes watching from windows and doorways. He must have looked like something dragged up from hell, filthy, exhausted, carrying a child who might already be dying. But he didn't care about appearances. He just focused on putting one foot in front of the other until he reached the building with the blue door. He kicked it open and found himself in a small waiting room that smelled like carbolic acid and something bitter he couldn't identify. A man emerged from a back room, elderly but sharp-eyed, wearing a vest and rolled shirt sleeves. "I don't open for another—" He stopped when he saw Lena. "Put her on the table. Now." Elias carried Lena into the examination room and laid her down as gently as he could. She didn't open her eyes, didn't respond when the doctor called her name and patted her cheek. The doctor worked quickly, cutting away the makeshift bandage and exposing the infected ankle. He sucked in a sharp breath through his teeth. How long has it been like this? 2 days, maybe 3. We've been running. From what? Elias met the doctor's eyes and saw intelligence there, and suspicion, and something that might have been understanding. From men who think they own her, Elias said quietly. The doctor held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once and turned back to Lena. I need to clean this and drain the infection. It's going to hurt, and she's going to need to stay still. Can you hold her? Elias positioned himself at the head of the table and gripped Lena's shoulders. The doctor brought over a tray of instruments and a bottle of clear liquid that reeked of alcohol. This is going to be bad, the doctor warned. Then he began. Lena screamed when the blade touched infected tissue, a sound so raw and agonized it made Elias's chest ache. She thrashed against his grip, trying to pull away, and he had to use all his strength to keep her still. I know, he murmured, bending close to her ear. I know it hurts, but you have to let him work. You have to hold on just a little longer. The doctor worked methodically, draining pus and dead tissue, cleaning the wound with alcohol that made Lena scream again. By the time he finished and wrapped the ankle in clean bandages, she'd passed out from the pain, her face pale and slack. Will she be all right? Elias asked. The doctor washed his hands in a basin and dried them carefully. The infection was bad, but I think we caught it in time. She'll need rest, real food, and clean dressings changed twice a day. And she'll need to stay off that ankle for at least a week. We can't stay that long. Then she'll likely lose the foot. Maybe the leg. The doctor fixed him with a stern look. Is that what you want? Elias closed his eyes and felt the last of his strength drain away. They'd run so far, fought so hard, and now they were trapped again, this time not by pursuit, but by Lena's own body breaking down. There's a boarding house 2 streets over, the doctor said, his voice gentler now. Woman who runs it is discreet, doesn't ask questions. You get the girl settled there, and I'll come by twice a day to check on her. I don't have much money. Didn't ask if you did. The doctor moved to a cabinet and pulled out a bottle of dark liquid and a tin of pills. These are for the pain. This, he held up the bottle, is laudanum. Small doses only when the pain gets too bad. These, he indicated the pills, are willow bark extract. They'll help with the fever. Would Elias took the medications with hands that shook. Why are you helping us? The doctor was quiet for a moment, looking at Lena's still form on the table. Because I've seen too many children destroyed by people who treated them like property, he said finally. And because sometimes doing the right thing means not asking questions you don't want answered. He gave Elias directions to the boarding house, then helped him carry Lena down the street. The boarding house was a 2-story structure painted white with green shutters, and the woman who answered the door took one look at Lena and ushered them inside without hesitation. Her name was Mrs. Catherine Walsh, and she was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair and hands that moved with practiced efficiency as she helped settle Lena into a small room on the 2nd floor. She brought water for washing, clean clothes, and a bowl of broth that she coaxed Lena into swallowing before the girl fell back asleep. She'll be safe here, Mrs. Walsh said quietly, standing with Elias in the hallway. But I need to know, are we expecting trouble? Elias looked at her, at the direct honesty in her eyes, and made a decision. Maybe, he said, there are men who claim legal right to her. They've been following us for days. Mrs. Walsh's expression didn't change. What kind of legal right? The kind that comes from contracts signed under duress, the kind that treats children like debt to be collected. I see. Mrs. Walsh crossed her arms. And do these men know you're here? Not yet, but they're persistent. Then we'll deal with them if they come. She said it with such calm certainty that Elias almost believed her. In the meantime, you look like you're about to fall over. There's a room at the end of the hall. It's yours for as long as you need it. Elias wanted to argue, to insist he should keep watch, but his body had other ideas. The moment he sat down on the bed in the small room, exhaustion crashed over him like a wave. and he was asleep before he could even remove his boots. He woke to afternoon sunlight and the smell of cooking food. His body ached in places he didn't know could ache, and when he stood, his legs nearly buckled. He made his way down to the kitchen and found Mrs. Walsh stirring a pot on the stove. "The girl's still sleeping," she said without turning around. "Doctor came by an hour ago, said the fever's down and the ankle looks better." Elias felt something in his chest loosen slightly. "Thank you." "Sit, eat." Mrs. Walsh ladled stew into a bowl and set it in front of him along with a hunk of bread. "You're no good to her if you collapse." Elias ate mechanically, too tired to taste the food, but grateful for it nonetheless. When he finished, Mrs. Walsh poured him coffee and sat down across from him. "I want you to understand something," she said. "This town sits right on the territorial line. That means we get people running from all kinds of things. Bad marriages, bad debts, bad men. Most folks here believe in second chances, but it also means we're careful about who we trust." "I understand." "Do you?" Mrs. Walsh leaned forward. "Because if those men show up asking questions, people are going to want to know whose side to take. And right now, all they know is that a stranger showed up with an injured girl and a story about running from trouble." Elias met her eyes. "What do you want to know?" "The truth." So Elias told her. Not everything, but enough. He told her about finding Lena in the storm, about the men who claimed ownership through paperwork and intimidation, about the chase through the canyons and the desperate jump into the river. He told her about Lena's strength and courage, about her determination to stay free, even when it seemed impossible. When he finished, Mrs. Walsh was quiet for a long moment. "The Hawthorne Mining Company," she said finally. "I've heard of them. They operate mostly in the Northern Territories, but they've got people everywhere, and they don't let go of what they consider theirs." "I know." "So what's your plan? You can't run forever, and that girl can't keep living like a fugitive." Elias had been asking himself the same question for days. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I know I won't let them take her." Mrs. Walsh studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "There might be another way," she said, "but it would require help and trust." "What kind of help?" "There's a lawyer in town, Daniel Garrett. He's young, but he's smart, and he's got a particular interest in contract law. More importantly, he doesn't like seeing people exploited." She paused. "I could arrange a meeting, quiet, discreet." Elias wanted to say yes immediately, but caution held him back. What if he decides the law is on their side? Then at least you'll know what you're up against. But Daniel's not the kind of man who hides behind bad laws. If there's a way to fight this, he'll find it. That evening, Mrs. Walsh arranged for the lawyer to come to the boarding house. Daniel Garrett arrived after dark, a slender man in his 30s with wire-rimmed glasses and ink-stained fingers. He carried a leather satchel full of papers and sat down at the kitchen table with the careful precision of someone who measured the world in statutes and precedents. Elias told him everything, and Garrett listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in a small journal. When Elias finished, the lawyer sat back and tapped his pencil against his lips. "The Hawthorne contracts are notorious," he said. "They operate in a legal gray area, technically binding, but ethically reprehensible. The problem is that most territorial courts uphold them because they're written carefully enough to pass scrutiny." "So there's nothing we can do?" "I didn't say that." Garrett leaned forward. "The contracts require consent, and a child cannot legally consent to indentured servitude, particularly if that servitude was entered into by a parent or guardian under duress. If we can prove Lena's mother signed under coercion or that the terms were misrepresented, we might be able to void the contract." "That would require evidence," Elias said. "It would. And it would require Lena to testify, to stand in front of a court and tell her story." Elias thought about Lena, small, fierce, carrying wounds that went far deeper than her injured ankle. "She's been through enough." "I know, but it might be the only way to end this permanently. Otherwise, she'll spend her whole life running." Elias stood and moved to the window, staring out at the dark street. Somewhere out there, 3 men were still searching, still believing they had the right to claim another human being as property, and they wouldn't stop unless someone made them. "If we do this," he said slowly, "what are our chances? Honestly, maybe 50-50. The law isn't always just, and judges have been known to side with mining companies. But if we can get the case heard in this territory rather than where the contract was signed, we have a better shot. The territorial governor here has been pushing for reform, and public sentiment is shifting. How long would it take? A few weeks to gather evidence and prepare the case. Maybe a month before we could get a hearing. A month. 4 weeks of staying in one place, waiting, hoping the riders didn't find them. It felt like an eternity. But Garrett was right. Running couldn't last forever. Eventually, Lena would need to be able to live in the open, to have a name and a life that wasn't built on fear. I'll talk to her, Elias said. He found Lena awake, sitting up in bed with pillows propped behind her back. The fever had broken, and though she looked pale and drawn, her eyes were clear. She smiled weakly when he entered. Mrs. Walsh brought me soup, she said, real soup, with vegetables and everything. Elias sat down in the chair beside the bed. How's the ankle? Hurts, but the doctor says it's getting better. She looked at him carefully. You look worried. I talked to a lawyer. He thinks there might be a way to fight the contract, to make it so those men can't come after you anymore. Lena's expression shifted, hope and fear warring on her face. How? Elias explained what Garrett had told him, watching her face as he spoke. When he finished, Lena was quiet for a long time. I'd have to testify, she said finally. Stand up in front of people and tell them what happened. Yes. What if they don't believe me? Then we'll figure out something else. But Lena, this might be your only chance at a real life. A life where you don't have to look over your shoulder every day. Lena twisted the blanket in her hands, her jaw working as she thought it through. Finally, she looked up at him. What do you think I should do? Elias reached out and took her small hand in his calloused one. I think you're the bravest person I've ever met, and I think you deserve the chance to be free. Really free. But the choice is yours. Lena stared down at their joined hands, and Elias could see her working through it, weighing the risk against the reward, the fear against the hope. Okay, she said quietly. I'll do it. The next 3 weeks passed in a strange limbo. Garrett worked tirelessly, sending inquiries to the mining camp where Lena's mother had signed the contract, tracking down witnesses, building a case piece by piece. Meanwhile, Elias stayed close to the boarding house, helping Mrs. Walsh with repairs and odd jobs to earn their keep. Lena healed slowly but steadily. The infection cleared, the swelling went down, and eventually she could put weight on the ankle again, though she walked with a pronounced limp. Dr. Haversham said it would likely always be weak, a permanent reminder of what she'd survived. The riders didn't come. Days passed with no sign of them, and Elias began to wonder if they'd given up or if they'd been called back to the mining company with news that the girl had disappeared for good. But he didn't let himself relax. He slept light, kept watch at odd hours, and made sure he always knew the fastest routes out of town. Then, on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after they'd arrived, everything changed. Elias was fixing a loose board on the porch when he saw them, 3 riders coming down the main street at an easy walk. Even from a distance, he recognized them. The same horses, the same confident posture, the same man with the badge riding in the middle. He dropped his hammer and ran inside. They're here. Mrs. Walsh looked up from her mending, face going pale. Are you sure? I'm sure. Where's Lena? In her room. Elias, what are you going to do? But Elias was already moving, taking the stairs 2 at a time. He found Lena sitting by the window, reading, and the moment she saw his face, she knew. They found us, she said. Yes, but we're not running this time. Elias knelt in front of her and gripped her shoulders. Garrett filed the petition yesterday. The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. We just need to hold out for 1 more day. What if they take me before then? They won't. I promise you, they won't. Heavy footsteps sounded on the porch below, followed by a sharp knock on the front door. Elias heard Mrs. Walsh answer, heard the low rumble of male voices. Stay here, he told Lena, then went back downstairs. The 3 men stood in the front parlor, hats in hands, looking around with the casual arrogance of people accustomed to getting what they wanted. The one with the badge, a marshal's star, Elias saw now, stepped forward. I'm Marshal Hayes, he said. We're looking for a girl. About 10 years old, goes by Lena Hale. We have reason to believe she's staying in this establishment." Mrs. Walsh stood with her arms crossed, blocking the stairs. "And what business is it of yours?" Hayes pulled a folded paper from his jacket. "I have a warrant for her recovery. She's property of the Hawthorne Mining Company, bound by legal contract. Her presence here constitutes theft." "That girl is not property," Elias said, stepping into the room. Hayes turned to look at him, eyes narrowing. "You're the one who took her. I recognize you from the settlement." "I didn't take her. I found her dying in a storm and kept her alive." "That doesn't change the law." Hayes unfolded the paper and held it up. "This contract is legal and binding. The girl belongs to Hawthorne, and I'm authorized to return her to their custody." "That contract was signed under duress," a new voice said from the doorway. Daniel Garrett stepped into the room, leather satchel in hand. "And it's currently being challenged in territorial court. The hearing is tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Until that hearing is concluded, the girl remains under protective custody." Hayes's expression darkened. "I don't recognize any protective custody. I have a warrant. And I have a court order suspending enforcement of that warrant pending judicial review." Garrett pulled out his own paper and handed it to Hayes. "Signed by Territorial Judge Morrison yesterday afternoon." Hayes read the paper, jaw working with frustration. Then he looked up at Garrett and something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "You're making a mistake, counselor. Hawthorne doesn't take kindly to interference." "Neither do I," Garrett said evenly. "The hearing is tomorrow. If you want the girl, you'll make your case to the judge like everyone else." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Then Hayes carefully refolded both papers and put them in his jacket. "We'll be there," he said, "and when the judge upholds the contract, we'll be taking what's ours." He turned and walked out, his companions following. Elias moved to the window and watched them mount their horses and ride toward the center of town. They didn't leave. They stopped at the hotel, dismounted, and went inside. "They're staying," he said. "Let them," Garrett replied. "They want to watch and wait. That's their right. But they can't touch her until after the hearing." Mrs. Walsh let out a breath she'd been holding. "That was too close." "It's going to get closer tomorrow," Garrett said. He looked at Elias. "Is she ready?" Elias thought about Lena upstairs, small and scared but determined. "She will be." That night, Elias sat with Lena in her room and went over what would happen in court. Garrett had prepared her as best he could, but there was no way to fully prepare a child to stand in front of strangers and recount the worst moments of her life. "What if I freeze?" Lena asked. "What if I can't remember what to say?" "Then you take a breath and you try again. And if you can't, I'll be right there. You're not alone in this." Lena nodded, but her hands were shaking. "Tell me about your mother," Elias said gently. Lena looked surprised. "What?" "Your mother. What was she like?" Lena's eyes grew distant. "She was strong. Even when things were bad, even when my father died and we had nothing, she never gave up. She always said there was a way through. You just had to be brave enough to find it. She was right, and she raised you to be just as strong. But she signed the contract. She gave me away." "No," Elias said firmly. "She sent you running. She chose your freedom over everything else, even her own life. That's not giving up. That's the bravest thing a person can do." Tears spilled down Lena's cheeks, and Elias pulled her into a hug. She cried quietly against his shoulder, grieving for a mother she'd lost and a childhood that had been stolen. "Tomorrow," Elias said when she'd cried herself out, "you're going to walk into that courtroom and you're going to tell the truth. And whatever happens after that, you'll know you fought back. You didn't let them win without a fight. Will you be there?" "I'll be right beside you, every step of the way." The courtroom was smaller than Elias had expected, just a simple room in the back of the territorial office with benches for spectators and a raised desk for the judge. But it was packed. Word had spread, and people had come to watch. Townsfolk curious about the case, a few newspaper writers from the territorial capital, and sitting in the front row, Marshal Hayes and his two companions. Lena sat beside Garrett at the defendant's table, dressed in a simple blue dress that Mrs. Walsh had altered to fit her. She looked impossibly small, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale but composed. Elias sat directly behind her, close enough to reach out and touch her shoulder if she needed it. Judge Morrison entered, a gray-haired man with stern features who called the court to order and listened as Garrett outlined the case. Then he turned to Hayes. "Marshal, you may present your evidence." Hayes stood and presented the contract. Pages of dense legal language that boiled down to simple ownership. Lena Hale, in exchange for settlement of debts owed by her mother, would work for the Hawthorne Mining Company until age 18 or until the debt was satisfied, whichever came first. "The contract is clear and legally binding," Hayes said. "The girl's mother signed willingly, and the debt has not been satisfied. Therefore, the girl remains company property." "Property," Judge Morrison repeated, distaste evident in his voice. "Is that the word you're using?" "It's the word the law uses, Your Honor." The judge made a note and turned to Garrett. "Counselor?" Garrett stood and called his first witness, Dr. Haversham, who testified about Lena's condition when she'd arrived, the evidence of long-term malnutrition and previous injuries consistent with abuse. Then he called Mrs. Walsh, who spoke about Lena's nightmares and the things she'd said in her sleep about the men who'd hunted her. Finally, Garrett called Lena herself. She walked to the witness stand on shaking legs, and Elias saw her glance back at him once before she sat down. He gave her the smallest nod, and she straightened her shoulders. Garrett approached gently. "Lena, can you tell us what happened the night you ran away?" Lena's voice was soft at first, barely audible, but as she spoke, it grew stronger. She told them about the men who'd come to the mining camp, about the things she'd overheard them saying, about her mother's fear. She told them about running through the darkness, about 3 days without food or water, about collapsing in the storm. "And what did you think would happen if those men caught you?" Garrett asked. "I thought I'd disappear," Lena said simply, "like the other girls." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Hayes stood up. "Objection, speculation." "Sustained," Judge Morrison said. "Stick to what you know, child." But the damage was done. The seed had been planted. Garrett asked a few more questions, then yielded to Hayes for cross-examination. The marshal approached with a sympathetic expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Hale, you've been through a terrible ordeal. I can see that. But can you tell me, did anyone at the mining company ever hurt you personally?" Lena hesitated. "No?" "Did anyone threaten you?" "Not directly." "So really you ran away because you were scared, because you'd heard rumors and let your imagination run wild?" "No," Lena said, and her voice was firm now. "I ran because I knew what would happen. I ran because my mother told me to run and not look back. She told me they would take me somewhere I couldn't come back from." "But you don't know that for certain." "I know my mother wouldn't have sent me away unless she believed I was in real danger, and I know she died protecting that choice." The courtroom went silent. Hayes opened his mouth, then closed it again and returned to his seat. Judge Morrison leaned forward. "The mother is deceased?" "Yes, Your Honor," Garrett said. 3 days after Lena fled. The company claims it was illness, but there were no witnesses and no medical examination. The judge made several notes, then sat back. "I'll hear closing arguments." Hayes went first, arguing the sanctity of contracts and the importance of upholding legal obligations. He painted Lena as a scared child who'd been led astray by a well-meaning but misguided stranger. Then Garrett stood and walked to the center of the room. "Your Honor, this case isn't about contracts. It's about whether we're going to look at a child who nearly died rather than submit to bondage, and tell her that pieces of paper matter more than human dignity. The contract in question was signed by a desperate woman under threat of starvation. It promised employment but delivered something far darker. And it claimed ownership of a human being, which violates every principle this territory was founded on." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Lena Hale is not property. She's a child who deserves the chance to grow up free. And if we can't give her that, then we have no right to call ourselves civilized." Judge Morrison was silent for a long time after Garrett sat down. He reviewed his notes, read through the contract again, and finally looked up. "I've heard enough," he said. "The contract presented by the Hawthorne Mining Company is void. Miss Hale is hereby declared a free person, with all rights and protections afforded under territorial law." The courtroom erupted. Hayes shot to his feet, protesting, but the judge's gavel cracked down hard. "Marshal Hayes, your warrant is dismissed. If Hawthorne Mining Company wishes to appeal this decision, they may do so through proper channels, but until such time, Miss Hale remains free and under the protection of this court. Do you understand? Hayes's face was red with fury, but he managed a tight nod. Then we're adjourned. Elias reached forward and gripped Lena's shoulder as she turned around, tears streaming down her face. She threw her arms around him, and he held her tight while the courtroom slowly emptied around them. It's over, she whispered. It's really over. It's over, Elias confirmed. Outside the courthouse, the sun was bright and warm, and a breeze carried the smell of grass and water from the creek. Lena stood on the steps, face tilted toward the sky, and for the first time since Elias had found her, she looked like what she was, a child with a future. Mrs. Walsh approached, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Well now, she said, voice thick with emotion, I suppose you'll be needing a more permanent place to stay. Lena looked at Elias, uncertainty flickering across her face. What happens now? Elias crouched down so they were eye level. That's up to you. Mrs. Walsh has offered to let you stay at the boarding house. There's a school here, and people who will look after you. You can have a real life. What about you? Elias glanced toward the mountains in the distance, toward the cabin he'd left behind and the life he'd built in solitude. It would be easy to go back, to return to the silence and the safety of isolation. But when he looked at Lena, at the hope and fear warring in her eyes, he knew he couldn't. I think, he said slowly, that maybe it's time I stopped hiding in the mountains. Maybe it's time I figured out how to be part of the world again. Lena's face broke into a smile, the first real smile he'd ever seen from her. So you'll stay? If you want me to. I want you to. Mrs. Walsh cleared her throat. I could use help around the boarding house, and the town could use a good man who knows his way around a hammer, if you're interested in honest work. Elias looked at the settlement spread out before them, the buildings, the people, the life he'd walked away from years ago. It would be hard, learning to trust again, learning to be part of a community, but maybe that was exactly what both he and Lena needed. I'm interested, he said. That evening, they ate dinner together at the boarding house. Elias, Lena, Mrs. Walsh, and Daniel Garrett, who'd been invited to celebrate. The conversation flowed easily, full of laughter and stories and the kind of warmth that comes from shared struggle and hard-won victory. Later, after the dishes were cleared and Garrett had gone home, Elias walked Lena up to her room. She paused at the door and looked up at him. Thank you, she said, for everything. You did the hard part, Elias replied. You survived. You fought back. All I did was help you along the way. That's not true. You gave me something to fight for. She hesitated, then added quietly, My mother would have liked you. Elias felt his throat tighten. I wish I could have met her. Me too. Lena hugged him quickly, then slipped into her room, closing the door softly behind her. Elias stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling for the night, the creak of floorboards, the distant murmur of voices, the whistle of wind through the eaves. It was strange being part of something again. Strange, but not unwelcome. He walked to his own room and stood at the window, looking out at the night sky. The stars were brilliant, scattered across the darkness in patterns he'd learned as a child and taught to his daughter before she'd died. He thought about her now, about the promise he'd broken when he couldn't save her, and about the promise he'd kept when he'd saved Lena. Maybe that was enough. Maybe saving one girl couldn't make up for losing another, but it was something. It was a start. Summer still held the land in its grip. Hot days and warm nights, the smell of dry grass and distant thunder. But autumn would come eventually, and with it, change. The mountains would turn gold and red, the first snow would dust the high peaks, and life would move forward the way it always did. Elias closed the curtains and lay down on the bed, exhausted but at peace for the first time in years. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying stories of survival and redemption, of second chances and found families, of a girl who'd refused to quit and a man who'd learned to care again. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the territorial line and the mountains and the endless sky, 3 riders turned their